The news arrived with the force of a thunderclap. Lady Eleanor Harcourt's petition to save the village school had been rejected before she even stepped through the magistrate's door. Word traveled faster than dignity in Ashford Hollow, and by the time she reached the square, whispers had already grown teeth. A widow recently returned from Bath, daring to involve herself in public affairs? How unbecoming, they murmured. Yet Eleanor walked with steady steps, her composure a fragile glass shield she refused to let fall. The magistrate stood on the steps of his office, puffed with self-importance as if the cold morning existed solely to sharpen his authority. Villagers gathered around him, heads angled just enough for judgment to slip from their tongues like smoke. Eleanor approached with the folded petition in her hands, the parchment softened by hours of anxious gripping. She had crafted every line carefully, outlining how the school's closure would leave nearly 40 children without instruction, how their parents, tenants of the Ashford estate, would bear the consequences most harshly. "My lady," the magistrate said loudly, ensuring the crowd heard every syllable, "it is unseemly for a woman in your position to concern herself with estate matters. These are decisions for those appointed to such responsibilities." Eleanor bowed her head slightly. "The Duke of Ashford has not received visitors for weeks. No one else has the authority." "He is mourning his brother," the man snapped as though grief were a justification for neglect. "And even were he not, he would hardly respond to entreaties delivered by someone of no official standing." No official standing. The words stung harder than the January air. Her late husband's debts had indeed diminished her social position, but this public dismissal felt crueler than any financial burden. Eleanor inhaled quietly, willing herself to remain composed, but the magistrate was not finished. "If the school closes it will be unfortunate," he said, "but the matter is settled. Go home, Lady Harcourt. Leave governance to those who understand it." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt the humiliation settle into her bones. Yet beneath it a firmer emotion burned, resolve. She straightened her spine, nodded and turned away. She would not allow her shame to define her purpose. As she walked down the cobbled path, voices rose behind her. "She seeks the Duke's attention," someone whispered. "Widows grow bold once freed of husbands." Another voice chimed in with malicious delight. "Imagine her thinking she can sway his grace." Eleanor kept her eyes forward, though the comments bruised her. She had never sought influence, only justice. The thought that her intentions could be twisted into something grasping made her stomach churn. Yet the Duke remained the only one with true authority. And if he would not come to the village, she would go to him. Across the valley, Ashford Estate brooded over the countryside like an abandoned fortress. Once alive with gatherings, it now sat beneath a silence so deep it felt physical. The Duke had not emerged since his brother's sudden death. Parliament summoned him. He declined. Correspondence piled unanswered. Servants moved through the halls with hushed footsteps. Inside the dimly lit study, the Duke of Ashford, Nathaniel Hale, sat alone before the fire, its glow unable to soften the hollowness carved into his expression. The portrait of his late brother hung above the mantel, the eyes painted with youthful warmth. Nathaniel could barely meet the gaze. Every time he tried, grief tightened around his ribs like a vice. 3 weeks. 3 relentless, suffocating weeks since he had closed his doors to the world. He had convinced himself isolation was a shield, yet it felt more like a punishment he did not understand how to escape. He had inherited title, land, and influence, but none of it filled the silence. A knock sounded from the entrance hall, faint yet distinct. The Duke stiffened. No visitors. He had given strict orders. Footsteps followed, soft, hesitant, belonging to a servant who feared delivering unwelcome news. "Your Grace," came a quiet voice from behind the study door, "a woman waits at the gate. She brings a petition regarding the village school." Nathaniel bristled. Even now, when he sought solitude, the world insisted on intruding. "Tell her I receive no one. She requested only that you read her proposal. She said she will remain until you decide." He closed his eyes. Persistence was a trait he neither admired nor tolerated. Yet something in the servant's tone, not reverent but solemn, hinted that refusal might ignite further trouble. "Very well," he muttered. "Bring it." Minutes later, a folded parchment lay before him. The Duke intended to ignore it. Instead, his gaze lingered on the signature, Lady Eleanor Harcourt, a widow known for quiet charity. He exhaled sharply, annoyed by the unexpected flicker of curiosity. He read the first few sentences. The clarity, the restraint, the careful appeal to his responsibility, all struck him like a whisper of the life he once lived. Outside the estate gates, Eleanor stood with cold-numbed fingers and a resolve warming her from within. She feared he would reject her petition without a second glance, but she would remain until a decision was made. She owed the children at least that much. The heavy iron gates loomed before her. The wind carried faint echoes from within, servants moving, horses shifting, the muted heartbeat of a household suspended in grief. Eleanor swallowed her apprehension and stepped forward. For a moment she hesitated, remembering the magistrate's scorn and the villagers' whispers, but retreat would mean surrendering the children's future. She steadied her breath, telling herself that courage was not the absence of fear but the insistence that something good might still be possible. She pictured the students seated at their rough wooden desks, eager for lessons they might soon lose, and the image strengthened her resolve. No matter how formidable the Duke or how distant his grief, she would not falter for them. She raised her hand. And she knocked. The scandal did not creep, it erupted with a violence Eleanor felt before she even understood its source. When she stepped into the marketplace the next morning, conversations halted so abruptly that the air itself seemed to recoil. A pair of young women near the milliner's stall stared openly, their whispers sharp enough to slice through her composure. Someone had already twisted her brief interaction with the Duke into something reckless, improper, and deliberately suggestive, leaving her reputation trembling at its foundations in a village all too eager to believe the worst without question or mercy that felt unbearable today. She walked forward with careful dignity, but the weight of every stare pressed against her like a physical burden she could not shift. A butcher's apprentice smirked as she passed, muttering something about widows who sought comfort in noble shadows. Eleanor's throat tightened, yet she refused to let indignity draw tears. Her only misstep, in truth, had been daring to care for the children whose futures now balanced on a fragile piece of parchment resting somewhere within the Duke's silent estate, where she prayed it might find a heart not entirely closed by grief and duty combined within him today. Nathaniel Hale had not intended to leave his estate that morning, but the clasp she had forgotten still lay on his desk, drawing his attention with an insistence he resented, yet could not entirely ignore. His brother had once praised the village school. The reminder stung like a reprimand. Grief pushed him toward stillness, yet responsibility tugged him outward. At last, compelled by a sense he scarcely recognized as conscience, he ordered his horse saddled, determined to at least confront the truth of the matter himself before judgment fell upon those who relied upon him without question or defense today. His arrival at the marketplace halted conversations as sharply as Eleanor's earlier entrance, though for vastly different reasons. Villagers straightened their backs, adjusting their manners with sudden, awkward precision. Nathaniel dismounted with an unfamiliar tension in his chest, aware that this was his first public appearance since tragedy had altered the course of his life. His gaze swept the bustling square until it settled, inevitably, on Eleanor, standing alone yet carrying herself with striking composure that marked her as a woman refusing surrender despite the hostility surrounding her like an uninvited storm cloud intent on ruining her fragile peace that morning. The crowd watched with greedy fascination as he approached her. Eleanor's pulse quickened, though her expression remained serene, shaped by years of learning how to survive scrutiny without crumbling. Nathaniel paused a respectful distance away, inclining his head. His voice, when he spoke, carried the faint roughness of disuse. He thanked her for the petition, quietly, sincerely, an act so unexpected that murmurs rippled through onlookers like wind stirring restless branches while she steadied herself against the tremor that rose unbidden within her, uncertain whether his courtesy signaled genuine regard or merely a momentary departure from grief's relentless hold upon him today. Before either could speak further, Mrs. Penwell emerged with a self-satisfied smirk that foretold calamity. She carried a small embroidered pouch in her gloved hand, dangling it between two fingers with theatrical delicacy. Declaring she had found it outside the Duke's estate, she proclaimed it must belong to Eleanor, for who else would have reason to linger so near? The implication ignited the crowd's imagination instantly, feeding rumor with irresistible fuel until Eleanor felt the breath leave her lungs beneath the weight of accusation delivered with false sweetness designed to wound her pride and unsettle the Duke beside her today. Eleanor opened her mouth to deny ownership, but Mrs. Penwell spoke over her with triumphant haste. The Duke, however, lifted his hand, silencing the swelling commotion. His expression hardened, not with suspicion toward Eleanor, but with unmistakable displeasure toward those who sought amusement in her humiliation. He inspected the pouch briefly before returning it to Mrs. Penwell, stating calmly that it bore neither Eleanor's initials nor any reason to be linked to her at all, and the crowd shifted uneasily beneath the quiet authority of his words which exposed their cruelty more clearly than any rebuke she might have offered herself. But humiliation, once sparked, rarely dimmed quickly. A child tugged at Eleanor's sleeve, pointing to the hem of her gown where droplets of mud now stained the fabric. Someone had stepped deliberately into a puddle beside her. She felt the sting of this smaller cruelty more sharply than the pouch incident, for it revealed the villagers' eagerness to punish her for daring to stand near the Duke at all, though she had committed no offense beyond compassion and courage shown in appealing for the school they claimed to value while abandoning her to whispered scorn without hesitation today here now. Nathaniel stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear him. He told her not to let the cruelty of small minds diminish her purpose. The words, simple yet unexpected from a man so recently withdrawn from the world, steadied her trembling resolve. She thanked him softly, unsure whether gratitude was sufficient for the shield he had offered her without hesitation or advantage. His gaze lingered on her a moment longer than propriety allowed, revealing a flicker of concern that unsettled them both as silence stretched between them in a fragile breath of possibility unspoken today morning now again. Before either could step away, the parish bell clanged violently overhead, startling the crowd and shattering the fragile hush surrounding them. A messenger hurried into the square, breathless and pale, clutching a sealed letter marked with the Ashford crest. He announced that the contents concerned the future of the village school, and that the Duke was required to read it immediately. Nathaniel felt the air tighten as he accepted the parchment, sensing its weight carried more than administrative consequence. Eleanor watched, heart trembling as he broke the seal, only to see his expression change with sudden, unsettling shock that froze everyone. It began with the sharp, unmistakable sound of a carriage door slamming, far too forcefully to be polite, which echoed through the courtyard like a verdict that had already been passed. Lady Eleanor had barely stepped down when she realized the Duke had followed her outside, his footsteps striking the gravel with a decisiveness that unsettled her more than his earlier silence. She had expected him to retreat back into his solitude after their meeting, but instead he stood only a few paces away, the weight of whatever he intended to say hanging heavily between them. For a moment neither spoke. The wind swept through the stillness, tugging at the edges of their composure, as if urging one of them to finally break the quiet. It was he who gave in first. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice firm but textured with something unguarded beneath it. "I should not have allowed you to leave under such a misconception. I have never, for a single moment dismissed the importance of the school." The earnestness startled her. She had grown used to polite evasions from aristocratic men, assurances that softened nothing and revealed even less. But here was a Duke, reclusive, grieving, guarded, speaking with the vulnerability of someone who feared being misunderstood. She turned to fully face him, her hands tightening on the folds of her cloak as she braced herself for the words she had never expected from him. "I know what grief can do," she replied softly, yet with the firmness of lived truth. "It narrows the world until one believes no corner of it holds light." She hesitated before adding, "I did not come to challenge you. I came because the children have no one else powerful enough to defend their future." Something shifted in his expression, something she could neither name nor entirely trust. "And you believe," he murmured, "that I might still possess that power?" She held his gaze. "I believe," she said, "that you have not forgotten who you were before tragedy claimed your peace." His breath caught, so subtly that anyone else might have missed it, but she sensed the tremor because her own heart answered it. For weeks, he had hidden behind walls built from sorrow and duty, but her words, spoken without hesitation or apology, found a fissure. He looked away first, his jaw tightening as if restraining emotions he had no practice confronting. When he finally spoke again, his tone carried a gravity that drew her closer without a single step. "You presume a great deal about a man you hardly know." "I presume only what I see," she replied. "A man who has not stopped caring even when he wished he had." Her honesty threatened his retreat. She saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, as though he fought the instinct to turn back toward the sanctuary of isolation. Yet he remained there, face half-shadowed by the early afternoon light, as if torn between who he had been and who he feared becoming. "You believe compassion can simply return?" he asked quietly. "After so much has been lost?" "Not return," she said, "but reshape itself." The simplicity of the statement weakened his defenses more effectively than any argument. His grief, once a fortress, felt suddenly porous. It unsettled him. It also steadied her. Before he could respond, the estate steward appeared in the archway, clearing his throat with an apologetic urgency. "Your Grace, there is a matter requiring your immediate attention. A letter from the Home Office. They insist it cannot wait." Ashford closed his eyes in resignation, as though even duty itself had recognized the wrong moment to intrude. Eleanor stepped back, offering him room to reclaim the authority he had momentarily set aside. "Attend to what you must," she said softly. "I shall return to the parish before nightfall." She expected him to let her go, perhaps with a distant nod or a polite farewell. Instead, his next words halted her with a force that felt more intimate than any touch. "No," he said, opening his eyes again. "Do not leave just yet." There was a plea hidden in the restraint of his tone, one that startled even him. "If the matter is brief," he continued, "will you wait? There is more I wish to say." For the first time since arriving, she felt her heartbeat stumble, not out of fear, but because this was the closest he had come to revealing the man behind the title. "I will wait," she answered. The steward stepped aside to lead the Duke inside, but Ashford paused once more, meeting Eleanor's gaze with a look that lingered a breath too long to be merely courteous. Then he disappeared into the interior hall, leaving her to wonder what words he believed she needed to hear, and why he suddenly seemed afraid she might vanish before he spoke them. Minutes passed, unhurried but tense, as though the very air sensed the change in their fragile equilibrium. Eleanor found herself replaying each exchange between them, surprised by how unguardedly he had listened, how uncharacteristically he had pursued her into the courtyard. She had not come seeking connection or acknowledgement, yet something about the Duke's struggle, his sincerity, his faltering attempts to re-engage with the world, stirred an empathy she had tried so hard to suppress since her own widowhood. She had thought herself past such delicate entanglements. Still, the echo of his voice remained in her ears. When the door finally opened again, Ashford did not step out with the same hesitance he had shown earlier. His stride carried purpose, and his gaze fixed on her as though he wished to continue the conversation precisely where it had ended. But before he could speak, the steward called after him with an anxious urgency, holding a second letter. "Your Grace, this one was delivered just now. Marked confidential." Ashford halted mid-step. Eleanor saw something pass across his features, a flicker of tension she could not decipher. He broke the seal, eyes scanning rapidly. As he read, the color drained subtly from his expression, not dramatically, but with the controlled dread of a man absorbing a blow while refusing to show the depth of it. When he finally lifted his gaze, the shift in him was unmistakable. Something had changed. Something serious. Something that concerned far more than a school or a state. "Lady Eleanor," he said quietly, "it seems the matter I wish to discuss may no longer be the only one demanding our attention." The wind stirred again, colder this time, brushing the hem of her cloak as though urging her to brace herself. "What has happened?" she asked. He folded the letter slowly, deliberately, as if weighing the consequences of what he was about to say. "It appears," he murmured, "that whatever peace we hope to salvage may be threatened by something neither of us anticipated." And with those words, delivered with a gravity that hinted at scandal, danger, or revelation, her entire world tilted, leaving her suspended between fear and something far more precarious: hope. The boom came not from sound but from a sentence. 6 scarcely believable words that shattered the fragile calm between them. "They accuse you of mismanaging funds." Lady Eleanor's breath caught at the Duke's revelation, though he had spoken quietly as though volume might worsen the wound. Mismanagement. For a nobleman, especially a recently appointed Duke, such an accusation carried the weight of both scandal and ruin. "The Home Office has received an anonymous complaint," he continued, each word tempered with a mixture of disbelief and restrained fury. "They claim Ashford's estate revenues were diverted during my brother's final year. They intend to investigate." Eleanor steadied herself. "But you were not even present then." "Truth rarely protects a man once suspicion has taken root," he replied. She saw now why his expression had darkened upon reading the letter. Rumor was a predator in their world, swift and merciless, and grief made the easiest prey. "Who would dare?" she whispered. Ashford hesitated, his gaze lowering. "Someone who understands the vulnerability of a man newly burdened with title. Someone who knows the estate's records remain disordered while I grieve." It was the closest he had come to admitting how deeply his brother's death had unmoored him. "I am expected in London," he added. "They require explanation." The tension in his voice was not fear of consequences but fear of failing those depending on him. "And the school?" Eleanor asked. "Shall it fall while you defend yourself?" His jaw clenched. "I cannot abandon it. Not after you brought its plight to me." She felt the sincerity strike her with surprising force. For weeks he had been a ghost, alive yet unreachable. Now he stood before her, fighting for 2 futures at once: that of his estate and that of children he had never met. "You must not face this alone," she said quietly. He lifted his gaze, startled by the simple certainty in her voice. "Lady Eleanor, your kindness is already far beyond expectation." "This is not kindness," she answered. "It is necessity. We must understand who benefits from your downfall." He looked at her then, not as a petitioner or acquaintance but as an ally. It unsettled him more than the accusation itself. "I do not wish to involve you further," he said. "Such entanglements can stain the reputation of even the most blameless." The warning was earnest, protective. Yet Eleanor stepped closer, drawn by conviction stronger than caution. "My reputation survived widowhood," she replied. "It will survive truth." The subtle quiver in his composure betrayed how deeply her words struck him. Before he could respond, footsteps approached from the far end of the hall, swift, purposeful, and undoubtedly familiar to him. His cousin, Lord Benedict Harwood, appeared with his usual ease, bowing politely to Eleanor before turning to Ashford. "I've just heard," Benedict said, skipping all courtesy. "An inquiry? Over funds? Absurd." Ashford folded the damning letter. "Absurdity rarely stops Parliament." Benedict's expression sharpened. "And you received this conveniently after refusing to sell the northern acres." Eleanor felt the air tighten. "Sell?" she asked. Ashford nodded once. "Several parties expressed interest. I declined." "Then someone has decided to punish your integrity," Benedict murmured. "And they intend to use scandal to force your compliance." Eleanor saw Ashford's expression shift, no longer merely troubled but quietly furious. "I will not be coerced," he said. Benedict clapped his shoulder. "Then prepare. This will become public within days." Turning to Eleanor, he softened. "My apologies, Lady Eleanor. You have arrived amid the worst of times." "Or perhaps the necessary moment," she replied. After Benedict departed, the silence thickened again, heavy with unspoken fears. Ashford exhaled slowly. "This is far worse than I anticipated." "Then let us begin with what we can control," she said. "The school must be protected immediately. Its survival will demonstrate your commitment to the community, and weaken any claims of negligence." He considered her suggestion, admiration flickering through his exhaustion. "You have a strategic mind, Lady Eleanor." "I have lived long enough to know survival requires strategy," she answered. Their eyes held for a moment, neither knew how to interpret. Something new, something fragile but undeniable, stirred beneath the weight of crisis. He looked away first, not in dismissal, but as though afraid that meeting her gaze too long might reveal more than he intended. "If I fail," he murmured, "the consequences will reach far beyond my estate." "You will not fail," she said. "Not now. Not with clarity before you." He absorbed her confidence as though it were a balm. "I suppose," he said quietly, "I must allow myself to believe that." "Believe instead," she replied, "that truth has allies." His features softened, an expression she doubted many had seen. "And you would stand among them?" She nodded once. "I already do." The admission surprised even her, though it felt more like revelation than choice. Before he could respond, the steward hurried toward them again. "Your Grace, a messenger from the parish. Urgent." Ashford braced himself. "What now?" The steward handed him a folded note. Eleanor noticed the trembling in the man's hand, proof that whatever news he carried unsettled more than just himself. Ashford read the note. His breath stilled. Slowly, he lowered the paper and looked at Eleanor with an expression she had not expected, one woven with disbelief and quiet devastation. "The schoolmaster," he said, voice barely steady, "collapsed this morning. They fear he may not recover." Eleanor's heart lurched. Not the school, not now when every thread of hope depended on its survival. "He was the one preparing the records," Ashford continued. "The only man who could confirm the estate's support over the past year." Understanding crashed over her. If the schoolmaster died, the last source of clarity and proof would vanish. "What shall you do?" she whispered. He folded the note with trembling restraint. "Ride to the parish," he said. "At once. If he still breathes, I must speak to him." Eleanor touched his arm lightly, not boldly but with urgent sincerity. "Then let me go with you." His eyes lifted to hers. "It may be dangerous," he warned. "For your name if not your person." "A child's future," she said firmly, "is far more delicate than my name." The slightest tremor passed through him, part disbelief, part gratitude, part something more difficult to name. "Very well," he said. You shall ride with me. He stepped toward the courtyard, but paused at the threshold, turning back just long enough to let the truth he had not yet spoken shadow his voice. If the schoolmaster cannot speak, he murmured, I fear the person behind this has already struck their most devastating blow. The words hung between them like a tightening storm, leaving Eleanor breathless with dread, and with the unmistakable sense that the battle for Ashford's future had only just begun. The boom came with the snap of the schoolmaster's door opening, echoing through the dim parish hall as if fate itself demanded attention. Nathaniel's pulse quickened, the letter from the Home Office still trembling in his hand. Eleanor followed closely, her cloak brushing the wooden floor, her heart caught between dread and hope. The man who had guided the village's children for decades sat upright in bed, pale and thin, yet his eyes brightened the instant they met the Duke's. Relief flickered, unsteady but powerful, like the first tentative light of dawn breaking over Ashford Hollow. Sir, Nathaniel began, his voice low but resolute, I fear the circumstances require your full attention. The accusation is not only absurd, it is deliberate. The schoolmaster nodded, his frailty betraying years of service but his mind sharp as ever. I have kept meticulous records, Your Grace. The funds, the accounts, the estate's obligations, they are intact. Whoever seeks to manipulate you has underestimated the truth. Eleanor moved closer, kneeling beside the bed without hesitation. Her hand rested lightly on the man's, a gesture of reassurance that carried the weight of decades of silent endurance. Then the school and the children are safe, she said, though her voice carried the tension of the unknown. Nathaniel's gaze softened, gratitude flickering through the grief that still lingered in his eyes. Thanks to you both, the schoolmaster whispered. The records can prove everything, should anyone attempt to distort it for their own gain. Nathaniel bent slightly, offering a rare, genuine smile. I am in your debt more than you know. And I fear, Lady Eleanor, your courage bears the same weight upon this village. Eleanor shook her head gently. We act only as duty demands. Reputation, rumor, or fear should not deter us from what is just. The Duke's gaze lingered on her longer than politeness allowed. Something unspoken passed between them, fragile yet undeniable, a bridge between grief and the possibility of hope, forged in mutual resolve and quiet admiration. Outside, the winter sunlight filtered weakly through leaded windows, softening the edges of the hall, yet within, tension remained. Nathaniel opened the letter again, tracing the carefully penned lines. Anonymous accusations had no foundation, yet they threatened the fragile peace he had barely begun to reclaim. I will ride to London, he said finally, his voice steady, to present the records personally. Only a direct account can prevent scandal from consuming what little trust remains among my peers. Eleanor placed her hand on his arm. You shall not go alone, she said. I will accompany you. Not as a petitioner but as witness to truth itself. He hesitated, the old pride clashing with an uncharacteristic reliance on her judgment. Then finally he nodded. Very well. Together, then. Preparations were swift but careful. The estate carriage, cloaked in dark green and polished to perfection, waited at the courtyard gates. Eleanor's gloved hands rested lightly on the edge as she adjusted her bonnet, nerves coiled tight yet steadied by resolve. Nathaniel mounted first, steadying himself as if the weight of duty pressed upon every muscle. When she followed, the air seemed to hum with the significance of their alliance, not just in the eyes of the world, but in a quieter, deeper understanding neither had fully acknowledged until now. The horses' hooves struck gravel in steady rhythm, a cadence that seemed to synchronize with their own heartbeats, carrying them forward into uncertainty with courage born of necessity and something warmer, something unspoken. The journey to London was a study in contrast. Cobbled roads blurred into rolling hills, frost glinting along hedgerows, while Eleanor's mind danced between worry for the schoolmaster and admiration for the Duke's steadfast resolve. Nathaniel, for his part, remained outwardly composed, yet Eleanor caught the subtle tremor of tension in his hands, the way his jaw tightened briefly whenever a thought of the Home Office pressed too closely. She resisted the urge to offer comfort in words, trusting that her presence alone could steady him, her silent determination a counterbalance to his own wavering confidence. Upon arrival, the grandeur of London did little to calm them. The city seemed alive with scrutiny, every carriage and passerby a reminder of observation, judgment, and the fragility of reputation. The Duke's estate records were examined, questioned, and finally verified by attentive clerks who could not dispute the meticulous documentation preserved by the schoolmaster. Eleanor observed quietly, noting the respect that the Duke commanded in spite of weeks of enforced isolation. and felt the subtle shift in the room's energy as whispers of accusation fell away like autumn leaves, leaving only truth standing upright. Nathaniel's composure, once fragile, became almost regal, tempered by Eleanor's calm presence. By late afternoon, the record secured, Nathaniel and Eleanor returned to Ashford Estate, their journey marked by quiet relief. The village awaited with hushed curiosity, yet the Duke's reputation remained intact. Eleanor noticed for the first time a spark of private pride in his eyes, a rare, unguarded acknowledgement that the world had shifted, if only slightly, in favor of justice and honesty. Children gathered near the schoolhouse, curious and hopeful, their innocent faces reflecting the triumph of those who had dared to act when circumstance demanded courage. Nathaniel allowed a faint smile, observing the small victories that made the weight of leadership bearable once more. In the quiet of the estate's drawing room that evening, Eleanor and Nathaniel finally allowed themselves the intimacy of reflection. A fire glowed, scattering shadows that danced across ornate wallpaper, yet neither spoke immediately. Words felt insufficient. Instead, they shared a measured gaze, each aware of the trials endured, the grief tempered, and the unspoken connection forged in adversity. "I do not know what the future holds," Nathaniel admitted softly, "but I know that I am grateful for your presence in it." Eleanor's lips curved gently. "Then let us see the future together as it must be faced, steadfast and unafraid." Her hand brushed briefly against his. The contact, fleeting but deliberate, carried the weight of understanding, trust, and a quiet promise that transcended mere words. As evening deepened, the estate settled into a rare peace. Nathaniel found himself walking the quiet halls, considering Eleanor's counsel, her courage, and the undeniable strength she had displayed at every moment. He realized slowly and profoundly that his heart, long shuttered by grief and duty, had begun to open again, not in haste, not in desperation, but with the patient warmth of shared purpose. Eleanor, seated near the fire, looked up and caught his gaze, offering a smile that was neither formal nor restrained, yet perfectly in keeping with the dignity of the season and their station. In that glance each understood the subtle shift. A bond had formed, unspoken but enduring. The night pressed on, the last vestiges of tension from scandal and accusation fading like mist across the moors. Yet as they spoke quietly, Eleanor's words trailing into thoughtful silence, Nathaniel became aware of a lingering shadow, the possibility that even now forces might conspire to test their resolve. And yet, standing at the edge of hope and uncertainty, he felt a courage he had not known since his brother's passing. It was quiet but it enduring.